The film star Val Kilmer, who played Batman and Jim Morrison, as well as starring in Top Gun, has died at the age of 65. His daughter said that her father had been diagnosed with throat cancer in 2014.
At 75, Kurt Russell has broken his silence about Val Kilmer. You see, behind Tombstone, behind Doc Holliday's cough, and Wyatt Earp's silence, there was never just a film set. It was a collision point between two very different kinds of actors. Years after Val Kilmer's throat cancer diagnosis in 2014 and the irreversible loss of his speaking voice after tracheotomy procedures, Kurt Russell repeatedly reflected on him in interviews. But to make any sense of what he said, and we'll visit that soon enough, we must start from the very beginning. The two actors on separate trajectories before collision. On March 22, 1979, the television audience watched in awe as a former Disney child star stepped into the shoes of Elvis Presley. At first glance, it looked like another television movie. In reality, it marked the beginning of one of Hollywood's most successful reinventions. The performance earned an Emmy nomination, shattered years of industry assumptions, and set a man on a path that would eventually lead to one of the most iconic westerns of the modern era. That man was Kurt Russell. More than 1,300 miles away, another future star was following a very different route to the same destination. In New York, a young acting student named Val Kilmer was immersing himself in classical training at Juilliard, studying performance with an intensity that would later make him one of the most unpredictable and fascinating actors of his generation. Neither man could have known it then, but their separate journeys were moving toward a collision point in the Arizona desert that would produce Tombstone and one of cinema's most celebrated screen partnerships. By the late 1970s, Kurt Russell had already become a familiar face in American households. Born in 1951 in Springfield, Massachusetts, he entered acting as a child under a Disney contract during the mid-1960s, appearing in family-oriented films such as The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes. By age 20, he had already spent more than a decade inside the studio system. The turning point arrived in 1979, when director John Carpenter cast him as Elvis Presley in the television film Elvis. That reinvention accelerated throughout the early 1980s, when Russell entered one of the most productive actor-director collaborations of the decade with John Carpenter. In 1981, he led Escape from New York, portraying Snake Plissken, a convicted criminal navigating a dystopian Manhattan that had been transformed into a giant prison. Produced for roughly $6 million, the film became a cult classic and established Russell's new screen identity: controlled, laconic, and operating comfortably within morally gray worlds. A year later, he followed with The Thing, also directed by Carpenter and filmed in British Columbia under freezing conditions. The film initially disappointed at the box office, but decades later, it was reassessed as one of the greatest horror films ever made. Russell's portrayal of helicopter pilot R.J. McReady became iconic. Meanwhile, Val Kilmer, born in Los Angeles in 1959, became the youngest student admitted to the Juilliard School's drama division at the time, entering at age 17. By the early 1980s, he had already appeared on Broadway in productions such as Slab Boys alongside Sean Penn and Kevin Bacon. Kilmer's transition into film began with Top Secret, followed by Real Genius, where he played an exceptionally gifted physics student. Both performances demonstrated unusual range, allowing him to move effortlessly between comedy and intelligence-driven drama. His breakthrough arrived in 1986 with Top Gun. Directed by Tony Scott, the film generated more than $350 million worldwide from a production budget estimated at roughly $15 million, becoming one of the decade's defining blockbusters. Kilmer portrayed Lieutenant Tom "Iceman" Kazansky, the disciplined rival to Tom Cruise's Maverick. By the late 1980s, both actors occupied established but fundamentally different positions within Hollywood, but their paths were destined to intersect. Hollywood's Western revival and the making of Tombstone. By the early 1990s, The Western genre had already been widely considered exhausted by Hollywood executives. For nearly a decade, studio output had shifted towards sci-fi, action, and high-concept thrillers, while Westerns had shrunk into near obsolescence after a series of expensive failures. Then, in 1992, Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven changed the equation. Released in August 1992 and grossing over $159 million worldwide, on a budget of about $14 million, the film won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. That shift sent a signal across Hollywood. Within months of Unforgiven's success, competing Western projects accelerated development, and one of them was Tombstone. The project began under screenwriter-director Kevin Jarre, who was also known for writing Glory, the Civil War film that had already proven his ability to handle historical intensity. Jarre envisioned Tombstone not as a revisionist Western, but as a tightly structured mythic retelling of the Earp Holliday saga, centered on Tombstone, Arizona territory, in the 1880s during the lawless mining boom period. Principal photography began in late 1992 in locations across Arizona and New Mexico, including actual historical sites connected to the gunfight at the OK Corral. However, production pressure built quickly. Studio concerns about schedule discipline and narrative control escalated within the first weeks of filming. Jarre was removed from the director's role early in production, with George Cosmatos brought in to complete the film. This shift created one of the most discussed behind-the-scenes dynamics in 1990s. Western filmmaking, a film that maintained continuity on screen while undergoing leadership change behind it. Despite the disruption, filming continued with a heavy emphasis on ensemble coordination rather than single-author direction. At the center of that structure was Kurt Russell, who played Wyatt Earp. Having spent over 25 years in the industry, including his formative Disney contract years and his defining collaborations with John Carpenter, Russell entered Tombstone with an unusually deep understanding of set mechanics. During production, Russell became heavily involved in shaping performance tone, pacing, and even scene structure. That influence was most visible in the film's tonal balance. Wyatt Earp was played with restraint, controlled emotional expression, and strategic silence, contrasting sharply with the volatility of other characters. Russell's approach anchored the narrative, ensuring that the film did not collapse into episodic gunfights, but maintained a continuous psychological line. Law enforcement as endurance rather than action. This was particularly significant given the production instability. Around him, the ensemble cast formed into one of the most densely packed Western lineups of the decade. Sam Elliott played Virgil Earp. Bill Paxton portrayed Morgan Earp. Powers Booth took on Curly Bill Brocius, bringing a cold, almost bureaucratic menace to outlaw leadership. Michael Biehn played Johnny Ringo, constructing a rival presence. Each casting choice reinforced a specific structural function within the film rather than simple character presence. The Earp brothers represented institutional escalation, law expanding into organized violence, while the outlaw figures represented decentralized resistance operating under its own internal logic. Within this framework, Tombstone itself, the Arizona mining town, became more than a setting. It operated as a pressure chamber where economic expansion, territorial law, and personal vendettas collided in confined geography. Production locations reinforced this sense of compression. Filming in the American Southwest allowed the landscape to function as both historical reconstruction and visual isolation. Wide desert frames contrasted with tightly staged town interiors, emphasizing how quickly order collapsed when institutional authority was thin. Tombstone was not simply a response to Unforgiven, but a parallel interpretation of the Western's survival. One film deconstructing myth, the other reconstructing it under unstable conditions. In that instability, Russell became structural glue, but the other half of the equation was no less important. The collision of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday on screen. The collision of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday on screen began to take shape inside a Western that was already compressing history into controlled cinematic pressure. Kurt Russell stepped into the role of Wyatt Earp not as a romanticized gunslinger, but as a lawman operating under exhaustion and institutional limitation. By the time of the 1881 OK Corral gunfight in Tombstone, Arizona territory, Earp had already accumulated years of violent encounters as a deputy marshal in Dodge City and other frontier settlements. Russell translated that accumulated experience into physical restraint rather than outward aggression. His Earp rarely acted impulsively. Instead, he evaluated, contained, and delayed force until it became unavoidable. Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday entered from the opposite end of that spectrum, yet with equal precision. In Tombstone, Kilmer reconstructed Holliday not as a mythic gunslinger, but as a medical reality in motion. Historically, John Henry "Doc" Holliday had been diagnosed with tuberculosis in the late 1870s, a condition that progressively damaged the lungs and carried a near-certain fatal outcome in the 19th century. Kilmer converted that decline into structured performance mechanics. Coughing was not random. It was placed between lines to interrupt the rhythm and reset tension. Breathing was audible and intentional, shaping how dialogue landed in space. Even posture carried narrative information, with a slight forward lean suggesting both physical collapse and readiness for sudden violence. What defined Kilmer's interpretation was not deterioration alone, but control within deterioration. The performance operated on contradiction, a body failing under disease while the mind remained strategically alert. This duality extended into vocal design. His cadence was slowed and measured, with pauses that carried subtext rather than emptiness. Language became compressed rather than expansive, as if every sentence had already passed through internal filtering before being spoken. In this structure, Doc Holliday did not respond to situations. He arrived at them already resolved. The most structurally recognizable element of this performance was its handling of dialogue precision. The phrase, "I'm your huckleberry," drawn from 19th century American slang meaning a suitable match or willing challenger, was recontextualized by Kilmer into cinematic finality. Delivered during a confrontation with Johnny Ringo, it did not function as an escalation, but as a conclusion. The line effectively ended the negotiation before violence occurred, transforming language into a termination point rather than a bridge between intentions. This redefinition of dialogue contributed directly to the film's long-term cultural memory. When Russell's Earp and Kilmer's Holliday shared the frame, the film shifted from a narrative Western into a psychological structure. Their interaction was not built on traditional hero-sidekick dynamics, but on opposing operational logics. Earp represented law as a system, regulated authority, delayed violence, and coordinated enforcement. Holliday represented inevitability already in motion, death acknowledged, accepted, and therefore freed from hesitation. Neither character controlled the environment independently, but each controlled a different axis of it. Their alignment strengthened as conflict with the cowboys intensified, a loosely organized outlaw faction operating in Cochise County during the same historical period. Figures such as Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo functioned as destabilizing agents within the regional power structure. Against them, Earp attempted to impose order through deputization and coordinated response, while Holliday operated as an external force, unofficial, unpredictable, yet strategically aligned with Earp's objectives when required. The most critical contrast emerged in how both men processed violence under pressure. Earp delayed it until institutional or tactical necessity forced action, reflecting his background in regulated law enforcement roles. Holliday accelerated toward it, but without chaos. His violence was pre-decided rather than reactive. This divergence became especially visible in sequences leading toward and following the OK Corral shootout on October 26, 1881, where the film compresses historical events but preserves the tension between procedural hesitation and immediate acceptance of lethal outcomes. Silence functioned as an additional layer of this collision. Russell's Earp frequently paused before responding, creating temporal gaps that suggested calculation. Kilmer's Holliday often entered those gaps with irony, provocation, or disruption, effectively controlling conversational rhythm without overt dominance. In settings such as the Oriental Saloon, a real establishment operating during Tombstone's mining boom era, these exchanges were staged as verbal duels. As the narrative progressed, their partnership stabilized not through emotional alignment, but through functional recognition. Earp understood that legal structures alone could not fully contain the violence of the environment. Holliday understood that his own condition placed him outside conventional systems of consequence. This mutual awareness created an operational bond built on necessity rather than sentiment. The most enduring exchanges in the film emerged from this structure of accumulated pressure. Lines were not isolated expressions, but endpoints of sustained psychological positioning between two men operating under different definitions of control. But there was another side to this picture. Behind the camera, intensity, control, and production pressure. By the early 1990s, Tombstone had already entered production under conditions that Hollywood insiders later described as structurally unstable rather than simply difficult. The film began principal photography in late 1992 across Arizona and New Mexico locations, but almost immediately faced leadership disruption when original writer-director Kevin Jarrah was removed early in the shoot and replaced in practice by George Cosmatos. That shift created a rare production environment, a Western being completed under divided creative authority, where on-set decision-making increasingly relied on cast-level coordination rather than a single unified directorial vision. Within that system, Val Kilmer was already developing a reputation in Hollywood circles that extended beyond individual performances. During the early to mid-1990s, Kilmer's working relationships on several major studio films became part of industry discussion. On Batman Forever, where he played Batman, reports from production accounts described friction between Kilmer and director Joel Schumacher, particularly around communication style and interpretation of character tone. The film itself still achieved commercial success, grossing over $330 million worldwide. But behind the scenes, it contributed to a growing perception of Kilmer as an actor who prioritized interpretive control over production hierarchy. That pattern intensified in The Island of Dr. Moreau, a production that became widely cited in industry retrospectives as one of the most chaotic studio shoots of the decade. The film underwent multiple disruptions, including director changes from Richard Stanley to John Frankenheimer, extensive script rewrites, and disagreements between cast members. Kilmer's involvement in that production became part of a larger narrative about volatility on set, reinforcing the idea that his intensity as a performer often extended into creative negotiations behind the camera. In contrast, Kurt Russell maintained a markedly different professional profile during the same period. By the time Tombstone was underway, Russell had already accumulated over 2 decades of experience in both studio and genre filmmaking, including sustained collaborations with director John Carpenter on films like Escape from New York and The Thing. This long-term working relationship had shaped his reputation as a stabilizing presence on set, an actor comfortable with technical constraints, scheduling pressures, and collaborative direction without publicized conflict. On Tombstone, that reputation became structurally significant. With directorial authority in flux after Jarrah's departure, production relied heavily on ensemble coordination to maintain continuity across scenes. Russell's portrayal of Wyatt Earp was widely described in behind-the-scenes accounts as a grounding force, both in performance tone and in maintaining narrative coherence. While not formally credited with production control, his role functioned as a stabilizing axis around which scenes were organized, particularly in sequences involving multiple principal actors and complex blocking. The broader ensemble reflected a similar dynamic of disciplined execution under pressure. Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton, Powers Booth, and Michael Biehn formed a tightly interlocking cast structure that required precise coordination across action-heavy and dialogue-driven scenes. Filming in Arizona's desert environment introduced additional logistical strain. Despite internal instability, Tombstone achieved a level of on-screen cohesion that contrasted sharply with its production reputation. The film's final cut, released in December 1993, demonstrated continuity in tone, pacing, and character alignment that masked much of the behind-the-scenes turbulence. This divergence between production process and finished product became one of the most discussed aspects of the film in later industry analysis, a case where fragmented leadership still resulted in a structurally coherent narrative. The contrast between Kilmer's broader career trajectory and Russell's production demeanor became more pronounced when viewed against Tombstone's legacy. Kilmer's intensity would later be retrospectively associated with a pattern of high-engagement, high-friction productions. Russell, meanwhile, continued to build a reputation rooted in long-term collaboration, stability, and genre consistency, appearing in films such as Stargate and later Escape from L.A. Within Tombstone itself, these opposing professional energies converged without overt conflict on screen. Instead, they were absorbed into the film's structure, controlled performance meeting volatile intensity inside a production environment that required discipline to function. Time marched on. Success stacked on top of success for both. But then, something awful happened. The terrible illness. By 2014, Val Kilmer had already spent more than 2 decades working in roles that depended heavily on vocal control, tonal precision, and sustained theatrical projection. But that fateful year, Kilmer was diagnosed with throat cancer. The condition became serious enough to require immediate medical intervention, and it was treated in stages over the following years. He initially chose not to disclose the diagnosis publicly, a decision closely tied to his long-standing adherence to Christian Science, a religious movement founded in the 19th century that emphasizes spiritual healing and often encourages reliance on prayer and spiritual understanding rather than direct public engagement with illness narratives. This belief system shaped how Kilmer approached both the illness itself and its public perception. For a significant period, he avoided confirming reports that began circulating in Hollywood media and online speculation. Kilmer later acknowledged that his silence was partly personal and partly spiritual, rooted in a discomfort with framing illness as a defining public identity. Within Christian Science practice, there has historically been variation in interpretation, but critics of the movement have often noted tension between spiritual healing principles and conventional medical disclosure norms. In Kilmer's case, that tension played out in real time as speculation increased, while official confirmation remained absent. By the mid-2010s, however, the physical reality of the condition became increasingly visible. Kilmer underwent multiple medical procedures, including a tracheotomy, which permanently altered the structure of his airway and directly impacted his ability to speak. This was the decisive turning point, the transformation of illness from a private condition into a permanent public reality. The voice that had once defined characters like Jim Morrison in The Doors and Doc Holliday in Tombstone was gone, never to return. When Kilmer eventually addressed his condition publicly in 2017, the emotional framing was notably restrained rather than dramatic. He described the experience in practical terms, acknowledging that he had undergone treatment and that it had significantly affected his speech. He said it was difficult to talk and be understood. The impact of his Christian Science beliefs during this period became a point of public discussion, though not without controversy. Some observers questioned whether delayed disclosure had affected public understanding of his condition, while others emphasized that Kilmer's approach was consistent with a deeply personal spiritual framework rather than a rejection of medical care itself. It is important to note that Kilmer did receive conventional medical treatment, including surgery and chemotherapy. but his reluctance to publicly frame the illness in conventional terms reflected the broader philosophical tension between private belief and public expectation in celebrity culture. As his condition progressed, the consequences extended beyond health into professional structure. The film industry relies heavily on vocal clarity, continuity of dialogue recording, and promotional communication, all of which became more difficult for Kilmer to sustain in traditional form. This effectively narrowed the range of roles available to him, shifting his career away from dialogue-driven performances toward limited appearances, archival usage, and, eventually, documentary reconstruction. It redirected how his identity as a performer was expressed on screen. Rather than continuing as an active leading man, Kilmer transitioned into a figure whose career was increasingly interpreted through memory, archive, and retrospective framing. This shift became formally realized in Val, a documentary constructed from decades of personal footage he had recorded throughout his life. The film did not follow a traditional documentary structure. Instead of external narration or standard interview retrospection, it relied heavily on Kilmer's own archival recordings, layered with narration by his son, Jack Kilmer. The documentary traced his early theatrical development, including his Juilliard years, where he had become one of the youngest students admitted to its drama program, and his early screen breakthrough in Top Secret. It moved through his commercial rise in Top Gun, his immersive transformation in The Doors, and his later career volatility, including productions where his intensity as an actor intersected with increasingly complex production environments. Importantly, Val did not present illness as a separate chapter, but as an integrated condition within his entire life narrative, something that reshaped, rather than interrupted, his identity as a performer. In 2022, Kilmer returned briefly to one of his most recognizable roles in Top Gun, Maverick, reprising Tom "Iceman" Kazansky nearly 36 years after the original Top Gun. The production approached his condition not as an obstacle to be concealed, but as part of the character's reality. His dialogue was minimal, and portions of his voice were digitally assisted to reconstruct intelligibility. The scene itself was structured less as exposition and more as closure, a final interaction between two characters defined by rivalry, discipline, and mutual recognition. In narrative terms, it functioned as an endpoint rather than a continuation. Across his broader career, Kilmer's reputation stabilized into a consistent critical framework: immersive preparation, high-intensity character embodiment, and a tendency to prioritize the internal truth of performance over production convenience. This approach had already produced some of his most enduring work, including Doc Holliday in Tombstone. It also extended to roles like Chris Shiherlis in Heat, where his restrained physicality and emotional containment contributed to the film's reputation as one of the defining American crime dramas of its era. But then, it all came to an end. Val Kilmer died at the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles on April 1, 2025. He was 65 years old. His immediate cause of death was listed as pneumonia, a common but often fatal complication in patients with compromised respiratory systems. Beneath that surface diagnosis lay a far more complex medical chain: acute hypoxemic respiratory failure and chronic respiratory failure, conditions indicating the body's long-term inability to maintain adequate oxygen exchange. These were compounded by squamous cell carcinoma of the base of the tongue, a form of head and neck cancer that had already defined the trajectory of his earlier illness, as well as malnutrition, reflecting the systemic toll of prolonged disease and treatment. Another contributing factor listed was a tracheocutaneous fistula, a persistent opening between the trachea and skin that can occur following tracheostomy procedures and long-term airway intervention. In the hours and days following his death, Hollywood responses arrived as fragmented testimony from collaborators who had worked with him across different eras of his career. Filmmaker Michael Mann, who directed Kilmer in Heat, recalled being struck by the range and precision of his performance style, describing it as a powerful current that shifted from moment to moment without losing internal control. Francis Ford Coppola, who worked with Kilmer on Twixt, framed his memory more personally, calling him a wonderful person to work with and a joy to know. Tom Cruise, Kilmer's co-star from Top Gun and Top Gun Maverick, addressed his death publicly at CinemaCon, asking for a moment of silence and noting that Kilmer loved movies and gave a lot to all of us. Oliver Stone, who directed Kilmer in The Doors and later in Alexander, described Kilmer as brilliant and acknowledged a shift in his working temperament over time, noting that his approach to performance evolved significantly between projects. Stone characterized him as turbulent, contradictory, and tortured, but emphasized that those qualities translated into unpredictability and vitality on screen. In his words, Kilmer remained exciting, always fresh, an actor whose creative instability often produced memorable results. A particularly intimate reflection came from John Densmore, drummer of The Doors, who had witnessed Kilmer's transformation into Jim Morrison during production. Densmore recalled being unsettled by how closely Kilmer captured Morrison's presence. He went further, stating that Kilmer should have received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. But there was one more man. What Kurt Russell said about him. In retrospective conversations, including widely cited coverage around a 2024 GQ interview, Russell consistently emphasized that Kilmer's work on Tombstone was defined less by improvisation and more by deliberate preparation and precision. He described Kilmer's Doc Holliday not as a performance constructed moment by moment, but as something fully formed in advance and then executed with controlled variation depending on the demands of each scene. Across those reflections, Russell's most consistent observation focused on the density of Kilmer's character construction. He repeatedly pointed to the way Kilmer embedded structure into Holliday's physical decline, vocal cadence, and behavioral rhythm. Rather than simply portraying illness in a conventional sense, Kilmer appeared to design a continuous internal system for deterioration where coughing, pauses, posture, and stillness all carried timing logic. In Russell's framing, silence itself functioned as part of performance. After Kilmer died in 2025, Russell expressed sympathy and recognition of the loss. Within that broader context sits one of the most frequently resurfaced elements of Russell's interviews, his account of the rap gifts exchanged after Tombstone. In a January 2024 GQ conversation, Russell described how post-production gift exchanges were not formal obligations but a common tradition among actors who had endured long and demanding shoots together. He recalled that his reflections on Kilmer emerged not as a structured tribute, but through recollection of this exchange, shaped by the dark humor and thematic weight that had already defined their work on set. Russell explained that after filming concluded, he arranged for a set of props associated with Kilmer's character, Doc Holliday, to be collected and preserved. These included costume elements such as a holster, weapon, and other production-used items linked directly to Kilmer's character identity. The intention, as Russell described it, was not simply to present memorabilia, but to preserve a moment tied to the end of production. Kilmer's reaction, as Russell recalled it, was immediate and direct. Rather than treating the gesture as ceremonial, he responded with characteristic bluntness, instructing his driver to take possession of the items without delay. Russell framed this response as consistent with Kilmer's personality on set. The exchange, in Russell's telling, mirrored their working dynamic during filming. It was also in this interview that Russell revealed the counter-gift. Kilmer had arranged for Russell to receive a burial plot in Boot Hill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona, a historic cemetery associated with figures of the American Old West and located in the same region where Tombstone was filmed. The gift was literal, rather than symbolic. Russell later summarized the contrast with a line frequently quoted in reporting. Doc Holliday was all about death, but Wyatt's all about life. In Russell's account, the remark functioned less as philosophical framing than as an observation about symmetry. Each gift unintentionally reflected the character logic both actors had embodied on screen. And this is how he remembers his co-star. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.